Everyone, thank you so much for joining this session today. I'm really excited to be, have a chance to talk about this issue. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Janine Yancey. I'm the CEO of Emtrain. We're a culture tech solution, really educating, informing, advising, and monitoring people's workplace culture. And we do that, through ethics, respect, and inclusion, which is, part of what we're going to be talking about today. But just to set the stage and the context for our conversation, I would say like mid 2019, I really started focusing on how we are kind of at a place in time that's really similar to 1920. And I actually wrote a blog post, an article that you can find on the Emtrain website. And this was in early January 2020, talking about how we're gonna basically relive the same dynamics and the same experiences that people had in 1920 in terms of changing social values. So 1920, for the history buffs out there, and maybe this is why my head goes there because I'm a history buff, we were changing from Victorian era to kind of more modern era in terms of social values and gender kind of positioning. As you'll recall, that was the whole, beginning of the flapper era. We had an agrarian economy moving to an industrial economy. So we had all these displaced demographics of people. We had influx of immigration. So we had this whole xenophobia and America first and very, nationalistic attitudes, completely in reaction to the influx of Eastern European, primarily immigrants. And so it was chaotic. As I kind of wrote in this article, January of 2020, we can really look to see what we experienced, 100 years ago to kind of inform or give us a heads up of what we're going to experience now. And I've been thinking about this topic really ever since. So, we're basically having the same dynamics where, our economy is changing. Our economy is changing from an industrial economy to basically a digital economy. So you've got a bunch of displaced people, and we're figuring out what are the rules of the road of a digital economy. We haven't figured that out yet. And we have all this social change. We've got, if you think about it, we've got 4 generations of people working side by side. We've got people that were born in the 1950s, and then we've got people that were born in 1999. And just think about how different those attitudes and those life experiences are. And that's all kind of in the maelstrom of people trying to work harmoniously together. And yet there's just so much turbulence. And if you move on, Hasina, with that turbulence, there's just a lack of clarity, right? There's a lack of well-established norms, and there's no guardrails. Here's an example from 100 years ago, and then let's go back to the most obvious example that we all just experienced. So, 100 years ago, there were many tragedies trying to figure out kind of the changing society, but one of the tragedies was the Triangle Shirtwaist factory fire in Manhattan. And it was just the thing, because people didn't know yet what to do, to actually lock up the doors. So you had, basically 200 women and girls sewing shirtwaists, sewing, tops. And the exits were barred. And why were they barred? Well, because the owner of that business said, well, shoot, I don't want people like lollygagging on my dime. I want to control everyone. I want everyone at work. So, from that perspective, it seemed, I guess rational. But it wasn't rational when a fire broke out and these people couldn't get out of the building because the doors were barred. And so like a 14-year-old died. I mean, all these women and girls died. And that's a reflection of not having well-established norms, the things that are thought out. And let's move to the current environment. We all just experienced thousands of people, some of whom are our military people, some of them are police officers, storm our Capitol with weapons thinking that that's okay. Like that, I mean, I bring it in not to be political, but just to say like, wow, we really don't have guardrails. We do not have a well-established norms of behavior of what's right, what's tolerable, and what's not. And, in that space, there's going to be a lot of chaos. So if we move on, like let's get our grounding here. Let's like kind of figure out what our foundation is. And if you move on, Hasina. So, really, when you think about society at the big picture, moving down at the micro level, our workplace, our specific organizations, the same things apply, which is our societal values, our culture is really defined by our ethics, our respect, and our inclusion. That's the foundation. Everything else is secondary. Those things are the primary factors that define everything, really. It defines how we interact with each other. And how we interact with each other is what creates our culture. So, really it's up to society and at the more micro level, private enterprise to help define our social norms. And so on this, when we kind of came up with the topic of our conversation today, I think what we have seen, and maybe anecdotally, but just to be a little bit more intentional about it, is there's a huge opportunity for private sector to help lead the way and establish our social norms. And if you go on to the next slide, Hasina. So there was an Edelman study in 2017 that showed that more than 50% of the people surveyed had more confidence and faith in private sector than they did in the public, in the government agencies, to help define our social norms. And, what comes to mind, I'll talk about what I have reflected there in a second, but what comes to mind is, we're basically a year out from this pandemic. And I don't know if folks, in our session today were thinking about this and remarking on it, but I certainly was. It was private sector that led the way. Private sector was the one that said, I don't care if there's going to be a mask mandate or no, what the government's saying, everyone, you're working from home. So, Emtrain did it. It's like, we didn't think twice. It's like, okay, everyone, new rule, everyone's working from home. We're not going to get each other sick. And that's, to me, that's an illustration of business leaders in the private sector kind of leading the way. This is uncharted territory. We don't really know, because we haven't had a generation to research of like, here's the best way or here's not the best way. And it's really up to the business leaders to figure out, okay, what makes sense? What flows naturally from our ethics, our respect for each other and the communities we serve, and for our ability to be as inclusive as possible. And so, what I want to kind of propose for everyone here is we can all lead the way as members and business leaders of private enterprise. And so if we look at, some of these brands that we have identified here, these are organizations that looked at societal issues of the day, figured out which societal issues flow naturally from what we stand for, that makes sense for our business, and let's take a stand on it. So Walmart is all about the family. Like they're the place where you go for large families to make sure that you've got what you need. And so it made sense for them to take a stand and say, you know what, we're not going to sell handguns because that's shown through social research that's got adverse effects on families, on children. CVS Health, they're all about health. So they said, you know what, we're not going to sell cigarettes anymore because the research shows that these are not healthy. Nike, they're about empowering and supporting athletes. And a large demographic of athletes are people of color. So why wouldn't they support Colin Kaepernick when he's fighting for inclusion and equality. Patagonia is about supporting everyone to, explore the great outdoors. And the Trump administration was encroaching on the Four Corners and the monuments in Utah. So Patagonia took a stand on that because it made sense for their business. Same with Airbnb. Twitter is empowering communication. Well, one would argue they're a little late to do that, but it made sense for them to finally say, this reflects our corporate values of good communication, and we can't allow misinformation on our platform. So, as we talk about this, we need to think about it first from a macro level and then a micro level. And what I mean by that is the macro level is, as leaders of a private enterprise, what makes sense for us to take a stand on in terms of societal issues to help lead the way and to help establish our values and our norms of behavior. And then at the micro level, everything we're talking about also applies to building our own workplace culture. And you have to do it in a consistent, integrated way, right? So if you're going to take a stand on a societal issue, you have to take that stand within your culture as well and just be very, very consistent on it. If you want to move on, Hasina. So one of our clients talks, they have a culture that they've termed a conscious culture, creating a conscious culture. And so I just, kind of borrowed from their lexicon, if you will, because I think it's appropriate. And so and again, I'm speaking at the macro level here, is how private business, private enterprise can help create, more norms of behavior and how we should all interact. When we think about creating a conscious culture at the macro level, there are societal issues today that map to our ethics, that map to our respect, that map to our inclusion. And I guess what I would propose for everyone here is go back to your C-suite and your business teams and think about the societal issues of today that make sense for your organization, right? So, and this is certainly not an exhaustive list. This is literally, I spent a minute to think of the issues of the day that kind of map to these three pillars, right? So for ethics, and because most businesses these days have, if they're not digital, they have a digital component. So, data privacy, right, is probably one of the largest issues, societal issues today on ethics. Corruption and fraud, antitrust. A lot of the big tech companies are going to be scrutinized going into this year and next year for anti-competitive measures. Money laundering. I mean, I'll just give you, kind of the brand that comes to my mind is Deutsche Bank. I mean, they're a bank. They're supposed to be secure and have integrity. And there are multiple governments around the world looking at them right now for money laundering. Like that just doesn't make, it's cognitive, a disconnect. It doesn't make sense. Your carbon footprint, and how are you respecting and being ethical about our resources? Addiction, so the pharmaceutical companies that were part of the opioid crisis, and creating addiction that really decimated a whole generation of youth. Social development. So all the social media companies, they just blithely went into social media without stopping and thinking about its impact on youth. And, as a mother of teenagers, I can tell you, and if we have other parents, in this session right now, if you're a parent, the horrific negative impacts on our youngest generation because of social media. Suicides are up. I mean, it's just, there are going to be long-term consequences socially from social media on our youngest generation. And so when you think about weighing in on societal issues, these are all issues that may or may not make sense for your business to weigh in on, depending on kind of your business. Respect, you've got those, there, that's really, universal. I mean, if you're an organization, then respect and inclusion should be common denominators. One thing that I think comes to mind, I mean, we could talk about this a little bit in a bit, but as you think about the power of brand and brand appeal, and I don't have it at my fingertips, but I'm sure it would not take much kind of research to show that the brands that people love are more successful. They have more more duration, generation after generation. And conversely, if you don't have a lot of loyalty or a lot of emotional attachment to your brand, you're at risk. And so when we think about this, and as we're trying to package this message up for our C-suite, we need to think about, how does this connect to ultimately, the benefit of the organization? And it's all about building a strong brand that people are emotionally attached to. You want to move on, Hasina? So we talked a little bit about the macro level and having your private organization or private enterprise weigh in on societal issues that make sense for the business. You also have to do that, like I said, consistently within your culture, right? And so when you do that, it's all about changing behavior. And so you've weighed in on something, perhaps you have a policy or you have an executive, message or statement on it. That's not enough. That's just one component. You have to have a multi-pronged kind of strategy to actually change the culture and change the behavior of people. And so there, we have just an image there showing that you'll always have a ringleader. And then I think that this is maybe a novel concept for, HR leaders and certainly learning and development leaders. My background is as a former trial lawyer. And as a trial lawyer, when you're talking to a jury, you'll always have a ringleader in the jury. And the trial lawyer is always talking to that ringleader. And so with that as my personal experience, I was, intrigued to see, I fell upon some research by David Myers. He's a professor of psychology at the University of Michigan. And some of you in this workshop may have read some of his papers. But if you haven't, I recommend that you go ahead and do so. It's fascinating. And what he found was, we learn and we change our behavior by our peer network. And there will be one person who is more influential than others in our peer network that will get us to change our behavior. And so one particular study that he did that I think is relevant to this discussion is he did a control study, and he did 2 classrooms. And in one classroom, and the instructions for both classrooms were basically, it's like an open test book, and it was on the honor code and what have you. But in one classroom, he planted a ringer, and he told that ringer, tell everyone to cheat. And what do you know? That classroom with the ringer, they all cheated because they normalized cheating. Because the ringer said, "Oh, come on, it's really not it's not a big deal." Yes, they said they gave us these instructions, and the instructions said we're on our honor method and honor code and so on and so forth. But there's no harm, and we all need to go out to lunch anyway. So come on, and they normalized that one influential ringer normalized cheating. And in the other classroom where there was not that influence, they all did the right thing. And so the idea here, the concept is within your organization, know that you've got some ringers, basically. I guess I'm using my days from being on a softball team, like, who's your ringer? Who's the person who's going to help influence the rest of your workforce? And it's not just always top down. It's bottoms up and peer to peer. And so, that needs to be taken into consideration as you kind of craft strategies to change behavior within your organization. If you move on. So this is in our code of conduct program that we we provide to our clients. And this is one question that's in the actual program that's asked of employees, because it's kind of, a nice litmus test, really. Do employees believe that the business is acting consistently with its mission and values? Because you always want to be practicing what you preach and acting within and consistent to your mission and values. And when you're a little off center, that should be a wake-up call for the organization. So here you see the person responding is the little icon. The global kind of data is all the learners on our platforms, reflecting all the different organizations that we work with. And then the green is a particular company that's responding. And so in the green, it's a little bit off center. And just to connect the dots for you, I'll just illustrate. I don't want to pick on them, but just, as clinically as possible, I'll say that I was Google's first outside employment lawyer back when they were earnest and trying to change the world. And they had a very, strong set of values and norms that were operationalized and consistent within that whole workforce. And there was definitely do no evil, but it was also, bring the power of knowledge and information to every single person, in a very democratic way. And I will put out there that when they made a very cold calculating financial decision to go into China with the restrictions that China was imposing, they were not practicing what they were preaching. And I think that was an inflection point for them, because I think that their brand and the emotional attachment to their brand has really taken a hit. And that's something, it's just a very concrete illustration, an example of what we're talking about here, where we have the opportunity to be a loved brand, where people will go out of their way to support the brand because the brand is doing good things, or not. And when we kind of fall off the beaten path, then we're also posing greater risk to the organization. So going back to how do we start to holistically in a kind of multi-pronged way change behavior within the organization, we certainly recommend putting out a shared language within the organization. So Emtrain has what we call the workplace color spectrum, which is color coding conduct, not people, and having a safe space for everyone to give instant real-time feedback on certain decisions, certain actions in a way that's not threatening, that's not castigating, that's safe. And all of this is available to the community. It's on our website. We're just trying to evangelize basically and get people to think creatively about these issues. But Workplace Color Spectrum, all of our clients use it and have operationalized it. The one client in particular that I'm talking about that has what they call the conscious culture, they have the Workplace Color Spectrum, in onboarding, in career development discussions and discipline discussions. And again, it's a non-emotional way of giving feedback on conduct. And I think it's kind of self-explanatory. Obviously, we all want to be green. We don't want to be red. And then if we move on, other ways to change everyone's behavior, looping back to my comments on, we learn from peers. And I think when we do activities and training exercises, that doesn't necessarily take that into consideration. I think as organizations, we are way too top down for our own good. I think we need a little bit more peer-to-peer and bottoms up. And so as we're looking at, again, the foundation of a culture is your ethics, your respect, and inclusion. And instead of treating those as policies to be memorized, really what's called for is this takes practice. These are kind of competencies. I always think about this as, teaching my youngsters to have good manners. That's not just a one and done sermon. That's constant repetition, constant practice. And I think that the same actually applies to our workforce. We're trying to get our workforce to be aligned and be on the same page as to our ethics and our respect and our inclusion. And so as we think about having this be a peer-to-peer exercise and influence, the way that we approach it and that we're suggesting others think about approaching it in your own way is to have visibility. So again, these graphs, you show a scene to tee up an issue or a topic, and then you ask people what they think and what they see in their team. So here, the video at hand is somebody, having a conflict of interest and what's good for them versus what's good for their team or their business. And, all those poor decisions, they're all usually emotionally motivated. So the question is, all right, so, do you think that emotions influence your team members when they make decisions? Often or rarely, and it kind of gives them a graph of how other people are experiencing the workplace and the team. And then questions and answers that are also available for people to read. And we do it in a de-identified way because, again, everything has to be safe. If you're not safe, then no true learning is going to happen. And if you move on, Hasina. So same concept, but this time on respect. How do we treat each other and our team members? And again, teeing up a particular scene, a particular topic that you want to talk, you want to bring everyone's attention to, and then asking people, to weigh in on what they see and what they experience within their teams. So, this particular video is talking about or teeing up the issue that things happen in isolation, so little microaggressions. And in that one particular incident, it doesn't seem like anything, but it's in the aggregate that this one person's, experiencing, let's say, not just one incident, but maybe 10 or maybe 15. And just showing how likely is it that people are going to understand that and realize that. And certainly the majority of people say, yeah, it's not likely. And just teasing out that concept for people who don't have that experience, that don't have that mindset or perspective, is a nice way of peer-to-peer learning. It's sharing your experiences with your peers in a psychologically safe way. And then if we move on to inclusion, so we have a Black Lives Matter video lesson, and part of what we're trying to do in this lesson, again, is tease out some of the experiences and perspectives of some members of the workforce that others, may not ever get to know or hear about in a safe way. I think that it's psychology 101 that we tend to think that our perspective is the dominant perspective. And it's really, I think, helpful to see other people's perspectives and to understand, oh, actually, maybe my perspective is not the dominant perspective, or I didn't think about that, or I didn't know that. So to try to influence everyone in an impactful, safe way. And if you want to move on, Hasina. So when we think about strengthening the social fabric, again, I'll talk about the macro and then the micro. So again, at the macro level, we're talking about organizations weighing in on the societal issues of the day that make sense for their business. But you should be doing that in a really consistent, holistic way, meaning it's totally solid within the culture of that business as well, right? And so that's the micro. And so when we're thinking about how do we get it totally solid within our own workplace culture, Emtrain has come up with what we are identifying as the KPIs of culture, and we call them the workplace social indicators. And just to give everyone a little bit of confidence, we have an organizational psychologist on our team who's validated this, and we're currently talking to a couple of different academic institutions, who are also looking at this, because it's just a helpful framework for all of us to start to measure and analyze culture. And what this is, and Hasina, if you will put out the links to everyone so that they can see all this and get access to it. We're taking the foundation of culture, your ethics, your respect, and your inclusion, and decoding them to their essential ingredients, right? And the essential ingredients are split between the ingredients at the organizational level versus the ingredients at the individual level. So in ethics, we've got our system for making decisions, meaning do we have a culture that enforces or supports or influences all of us to slow down, at least have some process to make a decision? Or do we have a culture where it just allows everyone to shoot from the hip in a really emotional way? Do we have well-established norms of behavior? Because if we do, we know those are our guardrails. At the individual level, do we have accountability and trust? And so to start to diagnose and pulse for those KPIs. And at respect, we've got in-group, out-group dynamics, power dynamics. As a former employment litigator, I'll tell you, most of the cases that I had that I was defending were the manager that just was well-intentioned but didn't understand the implications of their power, right? So that's just a common one. Well-established norms again. And then you've got those at the individual level. So pre-existing experiences and mindsets, their social intelligence, their ability to read a room, and their unconscious biases and how that influences their assessments and their behaviors. And at diversity and inclusion, at the organizational level, we have again system for making decisions, valuing differences, and whether or not we have a strong culture of allyship where people understand what are allied actions and how do we do those on a really consistent way, cascading throughout the organization. And individually, our demographic experience. So how robust and rich is our peer network? If we have a peer network that reflects different generations, different races, different ethnicities, different genders, we know that's really rich and robust, and we can draw on our personal experiences to help inform our assessments. We don't have to guess. We don't have to just assume and guess. And then our curiosity and empathy to learn about different people, and authenticity and belonging. So those are at least Emtrain's recommendations for the KPIs of culture. And once you have the KPIs of culture, then you have a framework to start analyzing things. So at Emtrain, we like to probe and pulse, typically by putting out a video scene that gets people's amygdala acting and emotionally kind of engaged and reactive. And then once they're engaged and reactive, then we ask them, well, what do you see in your team? What do people do that you work with? And all the questions we're asking are designed to tease out information relating to one of these KPIs so that we get these KPIs about the culture. And it's quite effective. So, since introducing this in mid-2019, from mid-2019 to the present, we have 17 million employee responses relating to one of these KPIs that allows everyone to actually kind of measure. I call it's time to face the music and put yourself on the scale. No one will ever wants to put on to walk on the scale, but you can't actually change things until you kind of get a glimpse of where you're starting from and where you need to focus your time and attention. Because I think that most of the culture keepers of business, so whether you're the head of compliance or the head of HR or the head of talent or the head of diversity, equity, and inclusion, typically those leaders really are understaffed and under-resourced no matter how large the organization. And so because of that, we just have to be super focused and very strategic. And you can't spread yourself thin. You need to focus on those areas that need the most attention, where you can actually move the needle. And one last thought here. Maybe we could open up to some chat on the kind of chat forum. But when we started doing this, like I said, in mid-2019, and we had our first statistically relevant data set to start to look at in early 2020. And we published our 2020 culture report, but we're looking at all this data. And what was really mind-blowing for me, having worked as, in one capacity or another as a workplace advisor for my whole career, is to see the interconnectivity and the interrelation of all of this. So I don't think it's commonly accepted that if you invest in your ethics, you're actually going to get a bump and a benefit in your respect and your employee relations and your diversity and inclusion. Those all kind of operate largely in silos. And yet the data shows us that they're not silos. It's kind of like holistic health. You can't just, take one organ of your body and think that it's like, isolated. It's not. It's interconnected with the whole, physical body, and same with these. So if you invest in diversity and inclusion, you're going to get an automatic bump in your respect. And respect is just another way of describing your employee relations and your employee experience. So, if you invest in your diversity and inclusion, you're going to also at the same time be investing in your employee relations and your employee experience. And if you invest in ethics and compliance, that's going to have dividends again in your respect and your diversity and inclusion. So these are all interrelated, as we're showing here. And this is kind of a complicated graph, but happy to talk it through, with anyone who wants more information. But each of these workplace social indicators have ripple effects on other indicators. So I think that's all that I have. And I guess I want to just leave folks with, again, the idea that we're living in uncertain times. And I would say probably for the next 4 or 5 years, where our business models are changing, our economy is changing, our social norms are changing. And so it's going to be somewhat chaotic for the next 4 or 5 years. And it's up to all of us at the private sector to kind of lead the way, but to lead the way, identify the societal issues of the day that flow from and make sense for our business to weigh in on, and be holistic and consistent within our organization so that we're building the culture within our organization that is, a top tier culture that's, an employer of choice, where everyone, you're going to inspire such loyalty and emotion to your brand that it's going to have all these lovely ripple effects throughout the organization. And I think that pretty much does it. Thank you everyone for joining us.